Okay, so nutrients of concern during childhood. We're going to start first by looking at iron deficiency, which we've already covered when we talked about minerals in this class, but we will speak about today in context of childhood nutrition. Okay, iron deficiency is the most common micronutrient deficiency worldwide. And it's very important in the context of childhood nutrition because your iron status is tied to cognitive development. So kids who are iron deficient can't learn, and their brains don't develop appropriately. It affects things like mood and attention span, which of course is very important for optimal learning. Kids' brains are very sensitive to reduced iron concentrations even before blood deficits appear. Okay, so sometimes by the time you check a kid's blood and see that the iron levels are low, they've actually been deficient for quite a long period of time. And that's why regularly incorporating iron-containing foods into the diet is so important for kids. We're going to learn today how you can do that. Some things that are sometimes used to describe iron deficiency in kids is reduced motivation to persist in intellectually challenging tasks, as well as a short attention span and reduction in overall intellectual performance. Okay, kids who are iron deficient can't learn. They drop out of school, they end up becoming adults who have a lot of difficulties with increased work capacity. Okay, if you're an adult and you're iron deficient, you get out of breath, you get fatigued, you get very tired very quickly. If you don't have an education and you can't participate in the workforce and you're living in a poor country, you can think about how iron deficiency is very closely tied to poverty and malnutrition in the developing world. Even though we don't live in the developing world, iron deficiency is still a concern in our kids. It's certainly not as rampant, but you'll see upwards of 15% of toddlers are thought to be iron deficient in the United States. There's a couple simple ways we can make sure kids get enough iron. How much iron do kids need? We'll look at specific needs in a couple of slides, but it's anywhere between 7 to 10 milligrams a day. Now, on the food label, the daily value for iron is listed at 18 milligrams. So you and I as adults need about 18 milligrams. Okay, unless you're pregnant, of course, it goes up to 27 milligrams. Okay, well, let's say the typical adult looking at a food label needs 18 milligrams a day. So if you're looking at an iron-fortified cereal and it says one serving provides 50% of the daily value, that's 50% of 18. That's 9 milligrams. Well, since most kids need somewhere between 7 to 10 milligrams, 50% daily value actually means almost 100 for kids, right? Because they need about half of that. In addition to iron-fortified cereals, other good sources of iron include meat, fish, and poultry. Remember that MFP factor? Meat, fish, and poultry have heme iron, and that's the type of iron that's most well absorbed by the body. Yeah, things like dark green leafy vegetables like spinach and kale and collards, they have iron, but remember that's the non-heme iron. That tends to not be as well absorbed. So if you think about the typical kid's diet, it doesn't include a ton of meat, fish, and poultry. So it's important that there's a variety of other foods, including things like eggs, legumes, as well as grains. Okay, when it comes to grains, whole grains naturally have iron, and refined grains have to add iron back into them. Remember that enrichment law that says in the United States, if you want to eat white bread, fine, but the government says you need to add back in 4B vitamins and iron. Okay, so even though we don't encourage kids to eat a bunch of white bread, if they were, they'd be getting iron from the enriched flour, or if they were eating whole grains, they'd be getting naturally occurring iron. Milk should be limited in kids. Okay, for kids up to age 8, no more than 2 cups of milk a day, and for up to age 9, no more than 3 cups of milk a day. Remember, milk is a poor source of iron. It's got a bunch of other great nutrients in it, but we don't want kids to be doing 4, 5, 6 cups of milk, filling up on that, and then not having room for other important nutrients or nutrient-rich foods. As I mentioned, approximately 15% of toddlers are iron deficient. Okay, that's not as high as you would see in the developing world, but that's actually pretty high, considering that there's some really cheap and pretty easy ways to prevent iron deficiency, which we'll get to in a second. Who's at the greatest risk for iron deficiency? Preterm infants. Remember how at the end of pregnancy, the mom transfers that big chunk of iron to the baby, and that lasts the baby about the first 6 months of life? So even though breast milk is low in iron, we don't really care because hopefully the baby stayed in the womb for the full gestational period, got a nice transfer from the mom at the end of pregnancy, and is set for the first 6 months of life. But remember, starting at about 6 months of life, that's when the kid's iron stores start to deplete. And that's why the first food we introduce is iron-fortified rice cereal. Remember, iron-fortified because their stores are depleting, and rice because rice is the least allergenic of the grains. Okay, no one's really allergic to rice, so we start with the really easily digestible grains. Exclusively breastfed infants, if the mom breastfeeds well past the 6th month, okay, the kid could become deficient, especially if the foods that the kid starts to eat are not iron-fortified. And there's also correlation between children with developmental disabilities also being at increased risk for iron deficiency. So how can we get our kids to eat more iron? Okay, there's 2 ways. We can encourage the consumption of unfortified foods that are naturally high in iron, or the consumption of iron and vitamin C fortified foods. Remember, we don't give cow's milk until after they're 12 months old. Their GI tracts can't handle it, right? And their kidneys can't handle the protein and the minerals. But after 12 months, we need to regulate no more than about 2 cups of milk a day. And we encourage vitamin C-rich foods because vitamin C helps your body absorb more iron. So kids should be given a variety of fruits and vegetables like potatoes and bell peppers and strawberries and citrus fruits. Those are all good sources of vitamin C that will help them absorb more of the iron from their foods. Then there's other foods you can add into the diet that are fortified with iron and vitamin C. Okay, most formulas are fortified with iron and C. Okay, infant cereals should be fortified with iron and C. Okay. And then if in small amounts, a little bit of juice, if it's vitamin C or includes vitamin C, is good for kids. Although they can get the same benefit from the fruits. So here you see in more detail exactly how much iron kids need. And this is from your DRI tables. Okay. Let's focus on the 1 to 8-year-old group from the top table. That's where you see the 7 to 10 milligram recommendation. So if you're 1 to 3, a kid needs 7 milligrams. If you're 4 to 8 years old, a kid needs 10. Now that's about half of what adult females need. If you go into the second table, you notice that the difference between males and females starts at the 14 to 18-year-old category. For a lot of the nutrients, remember, males need more than females because they just have higher overall energy needs, which kind of trickles down to meaning higher overall micronutrient needs. But iron's not that way. Females need more iron than do males. And that starts at age 14 to 18. They need 15 milligrams compared to 11 that males need because it's somewhere in that period where most women start menstruating. When you start regular menstruation, you're losing blood on a monthly basis, so you're losing iron. Also, if you think about the typical diet of a 14 to 18-year-old girl, they're at very high risk for iron deficiency because on top of the menstruation, they tend to not eat a lot of red meat. We're going to talk about red meat having a really good source of iron. Okay, fish and poultry are as well. As far as the foods that contain iron, we've mentioned meat, fish, and poultry. Those are good sources of iron, but a lot of other foods that we eat have little bits of iron. And so the foods that you see listed in this chart all contain, on average, 1 milligram of iron per serving. Things like a half a cup of spaghetti, because spaghetti is going to be enriched. Okay, noodles, rice, or barley. 1 flour or 2 corn tortillas. Remember, kids need somewhere between 7 to 10. So if you picked 7 to 10 foods from this list and fed it to your kid, he or she would be meeting the needs. Not to mention that kids are going to probably eat more than a half a cup of spaghetti or half a cup of noodles. You may have 2 or 3 servings. It's 2 or 3 milligrams of iron. Iron-fortified kids' cereals are a really good way to get iron into kids. So we're going to look at a couple of different cereals in the next couple of slides here. And we'll start with Kix. Okay. There's lots of ways that nutrition experts recommend choosing kids' cereals. And I'll show you a couple of the keys. Okay. Usually we start with sugar. You like to see less than 5 grams of sugar. Okay, so if you've got kids who can read, a good task to keep them busy at the grocery store is find a cereal that has less than 5 grams of sugar. It'll take them all day because most of the cereals in the cereal aisle are going to have more than 5 grams of sugar. How many grams of sugar are in a serving size of Kix? 3. Okay, there's 3 grams of sugar. Another good rule of thumb is to look for one that has greater than or equal to 3 grams of fiber. And if you look at the Kix, you can see that there's 3 grams of fiber and less than 5 grams of sugar. So Kix is a really good option for kids. I've also circled iron on the food label. Iron has to be listed on all nutrition facts panels. And usually if you see something greater than 25%, that means it's been iron fortified. This is a really good one because one serving of this contains 45%. But remember, that's 45% of 18. That's 8 or 9 milligrams of iron. For most kids, that's all they're going to need for the whole day. Now, that type of iron is certainly not 100% absorbed. So it doesn't mean give up after you give the kid the cereal in the morning and no more iron for the rest of the day. Okay? A couple of the other foods that the kids will eat throughout the day should have some iron in it. And then cumulatively, that kid will have hopefully absorbed 100% of what he or she needs. But it's a really good way to start out the day with foods kids like anyway, which is cereal. Okay? And then you add milk on top of it for some additional nutrition. Not high in sugar, pretty good source of fiber, good source of iron. The reason why there's 2 daily value columns, you might notice that the first one is for Kix, and the second one is for Kix with a half a cup of skim milk. A serving size of Kix is 1 1/4 cups. Okay? And if you add the milk, then of course the calories go up. You can see the calcium and the vitamin D go up. The iron stays the same though. Notice how it's 45% in both of the columns. That's because, of course, milk is very low in iron. Let's look at some other cereals, and we'll talk about Cheerios next. This is the regular type of Cheerios, the yellow box. Okay? Cheerios toasted whole grain oat cereal. This Cheerios is not what most people think of when they think of Cheerios. When they think of Cheerios, this is what they think of, right? The Honey Nut Cheerios. We're going to compare the two, starting first with the yellow box, which is clearly the more preferable type of Cheerios. A cup of Cheerios has 100 calories. We've met both of the sugar and the fiber guidelines. There's 3 grams of fiber and only 1 gram of sugar in Cheerios. This is one of the best cereals you can give to kids, and for adults too. Okay. And then look at the iron. It's also at 45% of the daily value. And this is a great option for kids. The first ingredient is whole grain oats. Okay, the second ingredient is modified cornstarch, and then sugar. But there's no other sugars in there. When we look at Honey Nuts, you'll see there's lots of types of sugar in there. Unfortunately, most parents think that this is a good option for kids, and you can see clearly that it's not. Notice what happens to the serving size. Instead of being a cup, like we saw with the yellow box, the serving size here goes down to 3/4 of a cup. And the calories go up even though the serving size is smaller. Went from 100 to 110. So now you're eating less food for more calories. And of course, that's because of so much added sugar. Look at that. There's 9 grams of sugar in 3/4 of a cup of Honey Nut Cheerios. Remember, most kids aren't going to stop at 3/4 cup. Okay, they're going to have double that. At which point, you've got 18 grams of added sugar. Okay, that's about 75 calories worth of sugar. Remember, kids only get 100 calories discretionary a day. You just blew 75% of it if you gave your kid 2 servings of Honey Nut Cheerios in the morning at breakfast. Okay, in a food that a lot of parents think is good for kids. And if you look at the front of this package, you can see at the top, whole grain guaranteed. Remember, the front of the package is what the marketers put on that. Okay, that's the commercial. That check mark and the bursting with wheat, that's all stuff that General Mills wants you to think makes that cereal healthy. And then they have the facts up front where they kind of cherry pick some nutrition information. Okay, but they don't include a mention that there's 9 grams of sugar, because that's a lot of sugar for a kid's cereal. If you look at the ingredients, whole grain oats, then it goes to sugar, then cornstarch, then there's honey, then there's brown sugar syrup. Okay, a couple of different types of sugar in a smaller portion size. And then also note how the iron went down. In the yellow box, it was 45% in a serving. Now it went down to 25%. Another example of a product that's not so great but is definitely marketed to kids is Cinnamon Toast Crunch. Also by General Mills. Also got all that healthy looking check mark and number stuff on the front. But if you really take the time to look into the label, you see that there's 10 grams of sugar in a serving of Cinnamon Toast Crunch. And the iron is also lower there at 25%. Some parents get confused because they've been taught, okay, well, I thought if a food had the first ingredient saying whole grain, then that's a healthy food. And if you look at the ingredient list of Cinnamon Toast Crunch, it is whole grain wheat. But the second ingredient is sugar. And if you see there's 10 grams of sugar in that cereal, right after whole grain, the second highest ingredient is going to be sugar, meaning it's really not a great product for kids. As far as the iron recommendations for kids go, this is a little bit more detailed. This is in the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations. Okay. Basically saying kind of that range somewhere between 7 to 10 milligrams for most kids, most days, or all days of the week. Okay. Probably more detail on there than you need to know. I'm just concerned that you know the values that are on the DRI table. Let's talk about fluid need for kids. Okay, kids have a relatively higher need for water than adults do because more of their water is located in the extracellular space than with adults, where most of ours is in the intracellular space. And what that means is kids lose their water a lot quicker. Okay, so if as an adult you have diarrhea for a day or two, you're probably not going to die. But if a kid has persistent diarrhea, okay, they lose a much greater percentage of their body weight very quickly. Diarrheal disease is actually the number 2 killer of children under 5 around the world, right after respiratory infections. So diarrheal disease is really a big concern in the developing world. But here, of course, we want to make sure our kids are well hydrated for a number of other reasons. Diarrhea represents a serious threat to life in childhood and demands what's called oral rehydration solution. Okay, and that's what we kind of know as Pedialyte here. If you work in the developing world, okay, there's little salt packets that parents learn how to add to clean water to help resuscitate their kids if they're experiencing diarrhea. Here's a chart that tells you the amount of fluid needed based per kilogram. And you don't need to memorize these numbers, but just look that based on your weight in kilograms, okay, little kids need a pretty good amount of fluid. Of course, they weigh a lot less kilograms than we do. Okay, but you as an adult probably need 30 mils per kg, and that works out to about 2,000 mils, or roughly 8 cups of water a day. And we'll learn when we talk about fluid needs for adults that there's no real rhyme or reason to why people say drink 8 cups a day. One of the best ways to determine if you're well hydrated is to look at the color of your urine. Same thing for kids. They should be taught. Your urine should be light in color or close to clear. That means you're well hydrated. Lead poisoning I mentioned just because kids put everything in their mouth. Okay? Things like paint chip, clay, pottery, they can contain lead. Okay? Lead poisoning leads to things like poor cognitive development, confusion, disabilities. Severe poisoning can actually lead to death. Your body absorbs all minerals very well during periods of growth, like childhood. So it absorbs the good minerals, okay, like iron, but it also absorbs the bad minerals, like lead. Okay? Most kids are exposed to lead through things like dirt, non-food items, and then lead-based paints, pottery, clay, and imported candy and toys. A few years ago, we had kind of a rash of lead-based concerns from imported both Mexican and Chinese candies and toys, okay, that were shown to be high in lead, and kids were putting them in their mouth and actually seeing higher rates of lead poisoning. Next up is vitamin D. Okay, this is the American Academy of Pediatric recommendations. You've seen these previously, and you've seen the picture of this kid with rickets. Remember, rickets is vitamin D deficiency disease. That's where a kid whose bones aren't strong, when the kid starts trying to walk, the weight of the baby can't be supported by the weak bones, and so the bones bow out in the legs. We don't see a ton of rickets, but there has been a noticeable increase in the amount of rickets in the U.S. And that's due in part to some communities don't feed their kids enough milk. Okay, remember, kids need about 400 IUs a day. That's double the old recommendation. AAP used to say 200 IUs a day, which was cool because if you drank 2 cups of milk, you got your 200 IUs. But now with more data, they know that, it's actually 400 IUs a day that all kids need shortly after birth. Remember, breast milk's not only low in iron, it's low in vitamin D. So exclusively breastfed kids, actually the parents need to supplement with vitamin D. There's vitamin D drops that can do that. 1 cup of fortified milk has roughly 100 IUs. Okay, please make sure you know that. So if you know how many cups of milk a kid is drinking, you can do the math to figure out, okay, they're deficient by 200 IUs a day. which means they're going to need some supplements. And then lastly is fiber. We'll start first with carbohydrate. Remember, carbohydrate's a really unique macronutrient because all people age 1 and older need 130 grams a day. Okay, so your 1-year-old and your 21-year-old and your 51-year-old all need a minimum 130 grams of carb a day. Think about that. A piece of bread has 15 grams. And how small is a 1-year-old's stomach? You've got to space those carbs out throughout the day in order to help them get there. A carbohydrate provides glucose, which is your cell's energy source. Kids need a lot of carb. And the carbs that they should be eating should be naturally occurring sources of fiber, like whole grains, fruits, vegetables. The same thing you guys should be eating more of. But one thing we really don't want kids to eat when it comes to fiber are those fake fiber foods that adults use to lose weight, right? Things like Fiber One bars and Fiber One yogurt and fiber added to all these other junky foods. Because those types of fiber fill you up. And the point is to make adults feel fuller for longer so they don't eat and lose weight. But the last thing we want is for kids to feel full from fake fiber foods, okay, and then not be hungry to eat all the other foods they need throughout the day. Okay, so those added fiber foods are not good for kids, especially because in high doses they can actually lead to GI distress and cause discomfort. So the amount of fiber you see listed there, it's somewhere between 19 to 38 grams a day. Again, a kid's not going to sit down and eat 25 grams of fiber at once. You've got to space it out throughout the day. Somewhere between around 4 to 7 grams every time the kid eats. A piece of fruit has about 4 grams of fiber. The more fruits and vegetables and whole grains we can get in kids, the more likely they are to meet their fiber needs. And that really helps prevent against constipation. Okay, so that concludes our lecture on nutrients.